another edition of Land and Legacy by Griffith Realty. I'm Scott Griffith, President Griffith Realty, and Carol Griffith, my sister, is the Vice President. And we're ready to do another edition of podcast. This time we're going to deal with the what we hope to be an interesting subject of water quality, since we're such an area of a community of such fine lakes and streams. It'd be fun to talk about it. And so we invited a very special guest, Eileen Boekestein, who is with EAGLE, which she'll have to give us the full. It's the Environment, Great Lakes. I don't know what else the EAGLE stands for, but it used to be the DEQ, by the way I used to know it, right? And now it's the EAGLE, I think. So anyway, and so Eileen's going to talk to us a little bit because she is works with water quality, has worked with water quality, and we just wanted to talk a little bit about how do we know what's good, how do we keep our lakes clear, what's important to watch for, things like that. So Eileen, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So like you said, my name's Eileen Boekestein. I am the Environmental Education Coordinator at EAGLE, which stands for the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. So
nice.
That last E is energy. Nice. You got it. Yeah. So I have been with EAGLE for a little under a year, coordinating our environmental education programs. Prior to that, my work has been in environmental education, specifically around lakes, rivers, streams, watersheds, for many years. So I love talking about lakes, and I'm happy to be here with you all today. And the timing is really kind of interesting for this because we just wrapped up Great Lakes and Freshwater Week in the state of Michigan, which is a week to really celebrate our Great Lakes and our freshwater resources, not just the Great Lakes, but also all of the many inland lakes, rivers, streams, ponds that are a part of our state. So we've got over 36,000 miles of streams in Michigan and more than 11,000 lakes and ponds. So like you mentioned, It's an extremely important part of our community and of our heritage. So it's really important to understand and to take care of.
So generally, how is our water quality? Is it still real good? Is it? I mean, I'm sure there's pressure on it, but I mean, how do you generalize it?
Yeah, so one of the things that EAGLE does is we do monitor water quality in inland lakes and streams. An inland lake is a body of water that is larger than 5 acres in size. So smaller than that, we don't monitor. And we go through a rotation where we monitor as many as possible each year. Our water resources staff do, looking at things like dissolved oxygen, what kind of algae might be growing in the lake, to look for toxins that can come from blue-green algae blooms. We look for the nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus that could let us know that we've got some agricultural or residential runoff problems, and a variety of other chemicals and metals and things that might be harmful to water quality, sometimes specific to the site if we know that something nearby is potentially causing a problem there. So there's some monitoring that's done by our staff on a regular basis. We have a limited staff compared to the 11,000 ponds and lakes in our state. So they are on a cycle. We don't monitor every single one every year, but we also help run a citizen-led monitoring program called the Cooperative Lakes Monitoring Program. So folks who are interested in water quality on their own lake and want to get a lot more long-term data on the quality of their lake can enroll in that program, and they can receive some training to go out and do some of their own monitoring that then gets reported back to the state and can help us understand what's going on in those lakes in between the times when we actually get our own staff out there to monitor. And then sometimes if there's a problem, so if there's a concern, you see, there's like a big red spill in the water or there's a dead fish or something, you might end up calling, and we might send staff out to check out and see what's going on in those situations as well. So we do have a number, the Environmental Assistance Center. If you go just michigan.gov/EAGLE, EGLE, on our website, that phone number is right up there, and you can call or you can email if you see a problem that you're concerned about or have a question. But you can also reach out to folks in your district, a district office that's near you as well if you have questions. So yeah, it gets weird, but
no, it's very interesting. So does there tend to be a difference, say, between lakes which are, say, spring-fed versus maybe rely on runoff and the way the quality measure, how they change up in quality? Or is it just all the same groundwater and all works out the same? I don't know.
No, that's a really good question. You do see differences in the different kinds of lakes. And we actually have a system to measure, to describe lakes in different phases of their life cycle. And the system is called the trophic index. And so some lakes have very, very high levels of nutrients. Usually that's nitrogen and phosphorus, which are causing those aquatic plants that we like to call weeds growing. Many of them are native, but they're not necessarily nice if you want to swim right there. They can also cause algae growth. Those lakes that are, really have a lot of plant growth tend to be shallower, maybe have kind of a mucky bottom, lots of nutrients. We would call that a eutrophic lake.
Okay.
So it's kind of further along in what can be a natural aging process. On the other hand, you've got a lake like Michigan, for example, that's really large. It's very deep. It's very clear. You don't really think of it as having a lot of algae or plants, growing when you go to swim. We would call that an oligotrophic lake. And then some people might call that a relatively young lake. So we like to think in our minds that an eutrophic lake, a really like algae growing lake is bad, but it's not necessarily bad. That might just mean that it, is further along in the process. Maybe it's more runoff fed rather than spring fed. And if there's more runoff versus groundwater or springs coming into a lake, you are going to have more of that stuff that's on the ground that gets washed into the lake along with the runoff that causes that algae and some of those plants to grow. So that process of runoff taking in excess more nutrients than what would normally get washed into the lake is called cultural eutrophication. So that's kind of accelerating a natural process that happens in the lakes that sort of naturally ages them. And, sort of over very long periods of time, a nice deep clear lake might become shallower and more full of plants as things come into it. But a lot of times the way that we develop or use land around lakes can cause that process to accelerate, and they quote unquote age much more quickly. And then you start to see water quality problems, not just plants, but also things like road salts and chlorides getting in there, or other forms of pollution that could wash in. And we call that pollution that comes through runoff is called non-point source pollution. Okay. So we have a whole team of folks at Eagle in the non-point source program who work specifically on education and outreach and projects to reduce that kind of pollution in our lakes.
That's fascinating. In Brighton, we actually had an example of, I think, what you're talking about, the accelerated aging. If you're not familiar with it, I'll tell you a brief story. Brighton Lake was once, which is just attached to the city of Brighton, the sewage treatment plant once was at the north end of this lake. As the city of Brighton grew, too much phosphorus was getting into the lake, and over time, there was times when the sun was setting, the lake almost looked like it glowed green, So a developer came in, and it was a large, undeveloped area at the south end of the lake. It was actually the Stroh's company. In those days, they were doing development from the Stroh-Brurig family. And they took down the lake approximately, I think it was 10 feet, and let it sit for a couple years to re-energize or re-energize the lake. And during that same period, the wastewater treatment plant was moved downstream, shall we say, or down farther away from the watershed to the lake. And then they filled it back up, and the lake has been sort of recharged or brought back to a more youthful years, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
That was a fascinating treatment, but that was the way they brought it back from. They said it was unnaturally older than it was supposed to be, and now it's young again, I guess, or younger.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So that's a good point that you bring up, though, because a lot of people, when they think about water pollution, the first thing, I do a lot of work with kids. And so
Sure.
we talk about pollution. The first thing that they think of with pollution is like, oh, a big factory is like dumping stuff in the water, or the treatment plant is causing problems. And, those sources of pollution, which we call point sources, because you can point and say that's where the pollution's coming from, as opposed to runoff, which comes from a variety of sources and is harder to pinpoint. That's why we call it non-point. The point sources like factories and wastewater plants are so highly regulated and closely scrutinized that they actually, unless you have a big spill or a big, non-compliance event, which does happen, that's relatively infrequent. And most of our pollution of our lakes, rivers, and streams actually is that non-point source pollution that's washing in. So, that's an interesting thing where they were able to pinpoint that, maybe the wastewater plant, I don't know if maybe it wasn't in compliance with its phosphorus levels or something else was going on. But generally, when we have excess levels of nutrients or too high of chloride in the water, that's not usually a result of somebody dumping. It's usually a result of, the combined impact of everybody's actions on the watershed. And so it's very important. And it's one of the reasons I think it's great that you're highlighting water quality in this podcast, because it's important for people to understand that so many of the little things that they do every day on their own property or in local parks or while walking down the street can really impact water quality all across the state. So we all can do a lot. We are part of the problem, and we can be a big part of the solution.
That's right. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, we really appreciate that. Now, what about so people love to recreate in the lakes? Is that a source of a problem, or is it it's just cool? I mean, we grew up in this area. We've seen people water ski for years. You see jet skiers. All this goes on. There's a little bit of something that comes off. You see a little sheen from somebody, and you'll know that's been a leak. But is that a big source of issues, or is that just one of those little things? The bigger source is all the runoff and things like that.
It depends.
Sure.
Every lake is different, and every, community is different. It certainly can be a source. So Eagle does help run an outreach program called the Clean Marina Program, where, we work with other partners alongside people who operate watercraft to make sure that they understand how to take care of those properly. Because just like, if you're not taking care of your car properly and you get oil spills or leaks that can wash into water, same thing can happen with boats. So they can be a source of pollution. I mean, generally, people that I know who have boats, take pretty good care of them, and there can be accidents, but it's definitely something that needs to be taken into account, and people need to be careful with them. Another thing that people don't often think about with watercraft, well, I'll back up a minute and say we highly encourage people to get out and recreate on the water, because we want people to feel connected and to their waterways and to love them and have good memories in them, and be inspired to take care of them. So that's fantastic. We don't really do anything around, the conservation officers who work for the DNR do a lot of, enforcement around, ordinances and
Sure.
speeding and all that stuff. One of the things that's interesting that some of our team look at from time to time is the impact that recreational watercraft can have on shoreline health. So you, as realtors, you've maybe seen or talked about this with some of your clients who own homes along lakes where they have issues with their shoreline. Maybe they're getting erosion happening along their shoreline. And that can be a result of wave action that happens from those recreational watercraft. So that's part of the reason that you'll see those, no wake zones in some areas. It is to try to protect the shoreline. One of the things that we also do is partnering with other agencies to run the Michigan Natural Shoreline Partnership. So this is a program that educates homeowners who live on the shoreline of inland lakes on the benefits of softening their shorelines, having it be more naturalized with native plants to Michigan, less of the hard seawall, like the straight seawall, and more of the either like riprap or, or stone,
Sure.
or ideally native plants to recreate some of that buffer, because when you have a hard seawall, the way that the waves, it intensifies the wave action that happens in the lake, which can actually cause erosion to happen behind the seawall, at the neighbor's property or in other parts of the lake. So it's actually a lot healthier for the lake to have those native plants as a buffer along the edge of a shoreline, to have a more naturalized shoreline. It helps protect from erosion, but it also does help protect water quality, because those plants act as kind of a buffer and a filter of runoff as it comes into the lake. And they can filter out some of the dirt and some of the salts and some of the chemicals and some of the nutrients before they enter the lake. So there's a wide variety of benefits to those naturalized shorelines, and they can also be really beautiful. So we really promote that as well for folks who own property along a shoreline. And if you want to have a little beach, or if you want to have your dock and have a little open area, that's fine, but keep some of it, as much as you can, a little bit more natural.
Sure. And so that makes me think, I'll just ask, I don't know the answer to this. I know that if somebody says, gee, I'd really like to put down some sand because I want to have the beach, because we're so familiar with the mucky shoreline, shall we say, of a lot of inland lakes, is it your department that they're making that permit application to? Because I know they put an application in, somebody comes out, checks to make sure what the impact's going to be, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So things that happen along the shoreline, pretty much anything you're going to do to alter the shoreline, you are going to want to check with Eagle. And so a staff person will come out, and that's generally regulated under what's called Part 301, which is part of Michigan's natural resources law. So if you are, putting in a new seawall, or even if you're taking out your old seawall and putting in a different type of stone or something, that needs to be permitted. If you're putting in a permanent dock or a permanent boat hoist that's there all year round, that needs to be permitted. Beach sanding is definitely something that we need to come out and look at. And then the other thing, if you're doing any kind of dredging or excavation in the lake, that also needs to go through our department. So those are the big ones that an individual property owner would probably end up needing to talk to somebody at Eagle for. And then if you have an association or a watershed group, some of the other things that tend to come through our office are like requests for aquatic vegetation management. So if you are trying to treat the weeds, that's what my experience is. Yep.
People are trying to get the weeds taken out. Yep.
Yes, you need to get a permit for that kind of treatment as well. And that goes through a different part of our office, but It does go through Eagle as well. Yep. And then there's the whole non-regulatory thing of, if you want to learn how to take better care of your lake and you want to do some research and write up a management plan for your lake's watershed, that's where our non-point source staff would come in, and they would, there's some funding out there to help organizations write and implement watershed management plans to protect water quality.
Well, that's fascinating. So before I forget, because we are so impacted by the Huron River in our community, it works from right through our whole community, and every year we have all sorts of interesting events thanks to it. I don't know how much you do with the rivers, but I assume it's a lot of the same issues, but we have lots of shoreline issues. We have problems with, nowadays there's been some substantial flooding along the Huron River, which, as more people have studied it, says it's a lot to do with what's like things in the river and how, it's not as simple as there's more water. It's also how much vegetation's in it, how much trees are falling, how much the shoreline's changing, things like that. I don't know, is that part, have you studied much of that as it relates? So I mean, it's a big impact in our community to talk about Huron River, because it covers a lot of the community, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked for many years on the Grand River, and I'm good friends with the folks over at the Huron River Watershed Council, and I know they're doing some really fantastic work over there as well. And yeah, I mean, a lot of the same issues apply. Rivers move a little bit more quickly than lakes, and so there's a little bit of difference in some aspects, especially of the shoreline management. But in general, we want vegetation along a shoreline. Like that's the bottom line. Like the more plants, the better, because those plants are going to hold the soil in place for one thing, and that's going to reduce erosion. And they're going to suck up excess water that can cause flooding. And as they do that, they're going to soak up some of those excess nutrients and buffer the stream or the river from some of those pollutants that could wash in. So more plants is almost always the answer. Yeah. But you're right. It's not just that we're getting more water in the form of rain and snowmelt, which is true. Right. It's also that the water, the precipitation that we're getting as we develop land and as we build new houses and streets and parking lots and things like that, that creates what we call impervious surfaces, that's surfaces where water can't soak into the ground. And that generates, even if the rainfall doesn't change, that generates more runoff, because that's water that normally, naturally would have soaked into the ground and entered that river or that lake through groundwater, but instead is entering it through runoff, which happens much more quickly. And especially in communities, many of which, I think most of the communities along the Huron River, many of them have separated sewer systems. Yes, so your stormwater, your storm sewer is going directly into the river or to nearby lakes. And so when it rains, that water, it takes half an hour maybe, depending on where you're at, to get into the river. And that can really cause flooding. That causes that water level to fluctuate much more quickly than it would naturally. And it takes all those urban runoff pollutants into the river with it. And as that water level rises and falls really quickly, which we call being flashy, that can actually cause erosion along the banks because the velocity of the river increases. It's going so fast, and it causes bank erosion, which then causes more problems. So that excess volume of runoff can really be a problem. And trying to reduce the amount of stormwater runoff that goes directly into rivers is a huge part of our work as well, of trying to what I used to always say to kids when I was in the classroom doing watershed work was the 3 S's are important. You want to slow water down, you want to spread it out, and you want to let it soak in. So any kind of practice that slows water down, lets it spread out and soak into the ground is something that we like, because that reduces flooding and that reduces pollutants that are entering our rivers and streams. And so creeks and rivers, are a little bit more susceptible to that or you notice that impact of that runoff a little bit more quickly than in a lake, because a lake's water level doesn't always go up and down really fast in relation to rainstorms, whereas a river might.
Well, that's absolutely wonderful. So I can't believe the amount of information you shared with us, Eileen, in a very short time.
Very good. I love talking about rivers and lakes. You're just asking me all my favorite questions, so it's no problem.
I'm going to have to listen to my own podcast again to figure out what you said.
Yeah, I know.
But I really appreciate your taking the time. Our time's almost up, but I want to thank you so much for doing this. This was so wonderful. It's so important to our community to have good freshwater lakes and to have people be able to recreate and enjoy them. And you can imagine what people pay to be able to look at a lake out their window. They want it to be very nice. They don't want it to turn into something ugly or bad. So,
Well, you're right. And that's, on top of all of the benefits of we love lakes, we want to recreate them, we want to have a good time. There's lots of research out there on the connection between water quality and property value.
Yes.
So, it is very important to your home value to have high quality water. So, lots of reasons to take care of our lakes and streams.
Every day we recognize it, let me tell you, when we do our business.
Yes, you do. I'll bet you do. Yeah.
So, Eileen, thank you so much. Thanks for taking your time to do this. We really appreciate it. And for those who've been listening, this has been another rendition of Land and Legacy by Griffith Riley. Have a great day.